Hi, welcome back. We are reviving Can We Talk? We took a little hiatus due to some restructuring and then with everything else happening, trying just to get our feet back on the ground and get things moving and keep moving forward. So I'm excited to be back. And it's going to look a little different. It'll mainly be me, Darcy, the owner of the LearningRx here in Southern Minnesota, talking to you each week, short little 10 minutes or less segments on a variety of different things, all related to our brain health and our mental health. And so, lots of different things we're going to be discussing. My goal is to be bringing in different experts in the field, depending on what their background is, to share their insights and what they know and what they've seen, and just to help give everybody some little nuggets of knowledge that relate to how you can help support people in their brain health and how you can protect and do well with your own brain health. And so this time, I want to start with like a four-part series and looking at trauma. That's it's really become a big thing on the discussion. The research is really coming out on what trauma in childhood does to our brains, how it affects them in school and their learning, and even into their adult lives. And so today's just going to be a foundation of kind of giving some definitions and start the conversation. So, according to the Center on the Developing Child, a child's ability to cope with stress in the early years has consequences for physical and mental health throughout life, which probably doesn't surprise anybody. Um, but what do we mean when we say trauma? The National Child Traumatic Stress Network defines it as events that are perceived as threatening, either the life or physical integrity of the child or someone important to the child, and what is perceived as a threat changes with children's development. So again, a younger child might perceive something differently as a threat that a 14-year-old may not see as a threat. It causes an overwhelming sense of terror, helplessness, or horror, produces intense physical effects such as a pounding heart, rapid breathing, and trembling, and it's completely overwhelming the child's ability with their available coping strategies to use those. And so again, it's the perceived event, so you might not seen it as stressful or as traumatic, uh, but if the child did, it's their perception that matters. And again, it could be happening to them or someone that they care about and things that they witness. And so when we talk about trauma, that's kind of the definition we're using. Most of us think of, violence, but there's also other types of definitions of things that could be contributed to trauma. There's the direct physical and sexual abuse, either that they've experienced or witnessed, neglect, domestic violence, witnessing violence of some type. They might have witnessed a crime or violence in their neighborhood, community violence, just separation from important people. If they have been separated due to refugee status or being removed from the home for one reason or the other, those all compound the type of trauma they experienced. And so stress becomes trauma when the intensity of frightening events becomes unmanageable to the point of threatening physical and psychological integrity, whether it's of the child or the parent. And this is according to Lieberman and Van Horn. That's kind of the definition that they put in there on when it becomes a complex trauma and when it turns into that toxic, that stress that turns into trauma. And so looking at how stress affects the architecture of the brain, because again, stress builds into trauma, that there are three types of stress that we can be looking at. There's positive stress, which motivates development, and that's developmentally appropriate levels of stress can be growth producing. We experience this kind of stuff in normal life, learning to adjust to the essential features of healthy development and mastery. So you might experience it before you run a race. You might experience it if you perform on stage, that little bit of stress, the butterflies in your stomach. Um, your body might be a little anxious, you might sweat, whatever it might be. Those are motivating you to do better. So seeing those kinds of things are positive stress. Then there's tolerable stress, right? Stress refers to the stress response that could affect brain architecture, but generally occurs for briefer periods. And you may or may not have social supports that allow for the brain to recover thereby reducing and potentially reversing the harmful effects. So it might be a job loss. That could be a tolerable stress because if you've got, a spouse that's supportive, if you're able to access resources in the community to help you get through it, um, it's not necessarily years of job loss, that you're without a job and it doesn't get to the point of where, you lose your home and it compounds itself. That's the tolerable stress, the stress we deal with on most of our days. It's a couple days of stress, maybe a week or two of stress, but it's not something that's been ongoing for a very long period of time. And then there's what most of us have heard of and referred to as toxic stress. So, this is strong, frequent, or prolonged activation of the body's stress management system. Um, Stressful events that are chronic, uncontrollable, or experienced without the child or the adult having access to support provides these to be toxic stress responses and provokes those kind of toxic stress responses. This might be living in poverty. And so if they didn't have good, supportive, loving parents, that just compounds that level of toxic stress. So, living in poverty by itself is a stressful and traumatic experience, more so if you had really absent parents or if the parents are dealing with mental health issues or substance abuse issues and aren't there. If the parents are supportive and loving and working as hard as they can, the stress helps build that resiliency and makes it has it a little reduces some of that impact on that child's brain. And that's according to the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child on how excessive stress disrupts the architecture of the developing brain. And so it definitely changes the brain development with younger children when the brain is really forming. It has some very impactful and more immediate changes on the brain. With adults, it kind of has to rewire our brain. And so you might have to be in those situations for a longer period of time before it really starts becoming that toxic stress that you are experiencing. Early trauma and how it impacts brain development. Again, according to the Center on the Developing Child, there's a healthy stress system that turns on and off when we need it to. Um, and when we don't, it's essential to our survival. It's basically that fight, flight, protect um, mode that a lot of us have heard of in psychology. Relationships buffer you, especially young children, from that stress, and it promotes resiliency. And so, helping build them so they have a healthy stress response system is important. Chronic stress affects the brain, including things like memory, selective attention, self control, and the ability to turn off the stress response. Being chronically wired in that state of high alert interferes with the children's ability to explore and learn from their environment and socialize with others, especially if it's not a safe environment, then it's even more that they are less likely to interact and benefit from that and learn. States become traits over time as the brain is developing. And I think there's probably a lot of us. I know I myself have known some people and have said this before. They seem to thrive in chaos. And if life is getting too normal and life is getting too quiet, they figure out ways to create chaos in their life because that's, again, their state at some point in their life that was chaotic has become their trait of their personality, and they just struggle with how to function if things aren't chaotic, quote unquote, stressful, and that toxic stress. And you see that with children as well. So, again, the younger they are, the more that is embedded into their brain and the more wiring and the more connections that that is making. Um, because the brain is very plastic during the fetal and early childhood periods, this frequent or prolonged activation of stress hormones systems can alter functioning of neural systems, including the parts of the brain that are essential for learning and memory. And we're going to talk in another segment on how these adverse childhood experiences impact children's learning and what you might see in school and some of those types of things. And then toxic stress during that early period can affect developing brain circuits and hormonal systems in a way that leads to poorly controlled stress responses that Their stress response system will be overly active or slow to shut down when they are faced with threats throughout their lifespan. Again, according to the Center on the Developing Child. So that again means they might live in that chronic state of hyper chaos and hyper stress, or when they are faced with a stressful event, it takes them a long time to be able to shut down and get over it and calm that stress and have that stress calm down. And so trauma and stress are very intertwined. Not all stress is traumatic, but probably all trauma causes stress, if you will. And so thinking about how to manage stress, how it affects the brain. It affects your memory. It affects your attention. So you might see some of those things when you're having even that tolerable stress. You might feel like you're having a hard time focusing or that you're struggling to remember things. And it may be a matter of you need to manage and control the stress in your life and get that under control. So thanks for joining me this week. We will see you next week where we'll be continuing talking about trauma and how it can affect the brain and learning in school. And you guys have a great week. Thanks for joining me on Can We Talk?